Seoul, summer 2004. A police dog stops on a forested hillside outside the city. It won't move. It keeps returning to the same patch of ground, disturbed earth, slightly sunken, near the base of a tree line. The handler calls it in. What investigators uncover over the next several hours will make national news by morning and international news by the following week. Human remains, wrapped, buried, not in one spot, across the entire hillside. 11 people, dismembered and interred in separate locations, within walking distance of a Buddhist temple that families visit on weekends. One person did this. The same person had been doing it for weeks. And this hillside, this specific location, was not where the story started. It was where investigators finally caught up to a man who had already been killing for 11 months. His name was Yoo Young-chul, 33 years old, 14 prior criminal convictions, released from prison 13 days before his first murder. He had a goal. He had written it down, turned it over in his mind, held on to it through his last prison sentence. He wanted to kill 100 people. By the time those dogs found that hillside, he had killed 20. A psychiatric team examined him after his arrest. The evaluation took weeks. The conclusion was documented, signed, and entered into the court record. No mental illness, no psychosis, no break from reality, complete legal and psychiatric competence. He knew every single thing he was doing. This is not a story about a man who lost control. There was no moment of darkness, no point of no return, no single event that broke someone who had been whole before. This is a story about a man who looked at the world around him, identified the people he believed deserved to die, and spent nearly a year killing them, in one of the most modern, most surveilled, most densely populated cities in Asia. And almost no one knew. To understand what Yoo Young-chul became, you have to understand where he started, and what was taken from him before he ever had the chance to build anything. He was born on April 18, 1970, in Gochang, a small agricultural county in North Jeolla Province, a rural region in the southwest of South Korea. It was not a place of ambition or opportunity. It was a place people passed through on the way to somewhere else. His family left when he was young. After his parents divorced, Yoo moved with his father to the Mapo district of Seoul. Mapo in the 1970s and early 1980s was not the developed, commercially active neighborhood it would eventually become. It was working class, crowded, and economically marginal. The gap between what you had and what the city was offering people around you was impossible to ignore. In the rigid social structure of South Korean schools in the 1980s, where family background, material possessions, and social standing determined everything about how you were treated, Yoo was at the bottom. He was bullied, not occasionally, consistently across years, not for anything he had done or said, but for what his family didn't have. Poverty in that environment wasn't invisible. It was a target. He was quiet in response to all of this. He didn't fight back in ways that were visible. He kept to himself, and he drew. Art was the one area where Yoo showed genuine, documented ability. Pencil work, charcoal, detailed, controlled, patient. He applied to an art-focused high school, went through the full entrance process, and reached the final stage. Then came the color vision examination, a standard requirement for art programs. Yoo was colorblind. He failed. He was rejected. That was the end of any direction that involved building something. From that point forward, Yoo's relationship with legitimate society was essentially over. Not because one rejection destroyed a person, but because for someone who had already been given so little and who had been made to feel that so little was what he deserved, that door closing was the confirmation of something he was already being taught. He was not going to make it through the approved channels. What came next was not a spiral. It was a pattern: theft, fraud, a growing criminal record that accumulated without remorse or apparent concern for consequences. In 1993, he was convicted of rape, his first serious violent offense. He served time and was released. He reoffended. He served more time. By the time he walked out of Jeonju prison in September 2003, the record was extensive: 14 criminal convictions spanning roughly 15 years, 7 total years incarcerated across multiple sentences. There had also been a marriage. Yoo had been married. His wife stayed with him through earlier incarcerations, through the fraud, through the theft, through periods where he was simply absent. But during one of his later sentences, she left. She filed for divorce while he was inside. That divorce did not create Yoo's attitude toward women, but it confirmed it. In his own internal accounting, it was proof of what he already believed: that women were disloyal, that they used men and abandoned them when the usefulness expired, that they were agents of betrayal rather than partnership. He held on to that conclusion and let it calcify. He was released in September 2003. He had no wife. He had no prospects. He had a hammer. And he had already decided at some point in those final weeks inside what he was going to do with the time he had left. 13 days after his release, Yoo Young-chul committed his first murder. The target selection was ideological. Yoo despised wealthy people, not abstractly, not as a political position, but with the personal, focused resentment of a man who had spent his entire life watching others inhabit a comfort he was structurally excluded from. The affluent neighborhoods of Seoul, Gangnam, Yongno, the high-rise residential complexes with security lobbies and marble floors, represented everything the system had offered to people who were not him. He had decided those people deserved consequences. His method was considered. He worked at night when residents were asleep. He used a skeleton key to bypass door locks without forced entry. No broken frames, no visible signs of intrusion from outside. He moved silently through homes. He used a hammer, 4 kilograms, and he used it without hesitation. Death in most cases was immediate. He was in and out before dawn. And then, the detail that confused investigators for weeks, he left everything behind: cash on tables, jewelry in drawers, electronics in plain sight. In homes where wealthy families kept significant valuables accessible, Yoo walked past all of it. Police assumed robbery. The absence of robbery demolished that assumption, but it also left investigators without a motive category that made sense. If this wasn't financial, what was it? September 24, 2003, Gangnam District. Professor Lee Deok-soo, 72 years old, and his wife, Lee Yoon-ok, 67, killed in their home while they slept. Their son found them the following morning. The home showed no signs of forced entry. October 9, 2003, Jongno District. 3 victims in one home. Kang Eun-sun, 85 years old. Her daughter-in-law, 60. Her grandson, 35, who was physically disabled and could not have defended himself or called for help. 3 generations. One night, October 16, 2003, Yoo Chun-hui, 60 years old. Her son arrived at the home and found her still alive. She was conscious but could not speak coherently. She died within 30 minutes of his arrival. She was the only victim of the first phase found before death, and she could not describe what had happened. November 18, 2003. Kim Jong-suk, 87 years old, and her housekeeper, 53. While Yoo was attempting to open a safe, he cut his hand. He understood immediately what that meant. Blood at the scene meant DNA, traceable, identifying, dangerous. He set the house on fire before leaving. He had no forensic training. He had never studied criminal investigation. He had reasoned through the implications of a blood trace on his own and acted on it within minutes. He was not operating on instinct. He was thinking. Critically, when firefighters and the first responding officers arrived at the fire, they initially classified it as a possible accident or electrical fault. The connection to the earlier murders was not made immediately. The fire had done exactly what Yoo intended. It delayed the investigation, created confusion about the crime scene, and destroyed the most direct physical evidence that would have pointed to him. 4 crime scenes, 9 victims, almost no physical evidence. The investigation was running, but it was running in circles because every theory investigators built kept colliding with the same anomaly. Nothing was taken. December 11, 2003. Yoo met a woman through an escort service. For a brief period, days, perhaps a couple of weeks, she represented something approximating a connection. Then she looked him up. His criminal record was not difficult to find for someone who knew where to look. What she found, the rape conviction, the assaults, the extensive history of incarceration, was more than enough. She ended contact immediately. For most people, this is a painful but ordinary event. For Yoo, it was not painful in any recognizable sense. It was confirmation. He had already structured a view of women that allowed no room for their autonomy to be legitimate. In his internal framework, women who worked in personal services were morally inferior. They used men, extracted what they needed, and discarded the rest. The woman who had looked up his record and walked away was not exercising reasonable self-protection. She was, in his accounting, proving his point. He redirected his focus entirely. The campaign against wealthy households had run its course in his mind. He had enacted something. Now he turned his attention to a different category: women who worked in massage parlors and escort services. Women he believed society already considered disposable. Women he could reach through a phone call. Women who would come to meet him alone. In January 2004, between phases, Yoo was briefly detained for a petty theft and held for 2 days before being released. The officers who processed him had no reason to connect him to the Gangnam murders. The case had not yet been linked to a suspect. He had no outstanding warrants related to the killings. He walked out of the police station, free, and resumed what he had been planning. The operational structure of the second phase was more refined than the first in one specific and significant way: disposal. In the Gangnam and Jongno murders, Yoo had left bodies in place. He had relied on the fire at the last scene to destroy evidence, but the bodies themselves were found. In the second phase, there would be no bodies to find, at least not in any form that allowed for immediate identification or the establishment of a crime scene. He would contact massage parlors or personal service lines by phone, arrange a meeting, and wait. Sometimes he went to an address. Sometimes he had women come to a location he controlled. Once alone with the victim, he used the hammer. Then he dismembered the body. consistently into approximately 18 pieces per victim, according to later forensic reconstruction. He transported the remains, in bags, to the forested hillside near Banwon Temple on the outskirts of Seoul. He dug, he buried, he left, he returned to the city. The choice of the Banwon hillside was strategically sound in its simplicity. The forested hills outside Seoul were large, lightly monitored, and covered enough terrain that individual burial sites could be distributed across a wide area without creating an obvious cluster. The temple attracted visitors during daylight hours, but the surrounding forest at night was empty. No cameras, no patrols, no reason for anyone to be there. He used it as a disposal site for weeks without a single reported anomaly. March 16, 2004. Kwon Jin-hui, 23 years old, the first victim of the second phase. She had taken a client call. She had gone to meet someone. She did not come back. The people in her life noticed. A report was filed. But without a body, without a crime scene, without physical evidence, the case sat as a missing persons file. May 5, 2004. Kim Hui-sun, 25 years old. May 7, 2004. Shin Min-ah, 33 years old. 2 murders in 2 days. The pace was already different from the first phase. April 13, 2004. Between these murders, Yoo killed someone outside both victim categories. And Jae-sun was 44 years old, a street vendor who had sold Yoo counterfeit medication. Yoo tracked him down, killed him with the hammer, dismembered the body, and burned the man's van. It was not ideology. It was personal accounting. He had been wronged in a transaction, and he resolved it. Then he continued. June 2, 2004. Han Suk-cha, 35 years old. June 4, 2004. Jeon Yong-ai, 29 years old. 2 days after Han Suk-cha. June 9, 2004. Jang Kwan, 26 years old. 5 days later, June 18, 2004. Kim Ji-ho, 27 years old. June 25, 2004. Woo Gu-yeon, 28 years old. July 2, 2004. Kim Mi-yeon, 26 years old. July 9, 2004. Ko Sun-hui, 24 years old. July 13, 2004. Im Mi-yeon, 27 years old. 11 women across less than 4 months. The gap between the last several murders had compressed to days. The youngest was 23. The oldest was 35. All had responded to a client call. All had disappeared afterward. All had been buried in pieces on a hillside that no one had yet thought to search. What the numbers do not capture, what no list can fully convey, is that each of these women had made plans for the following day, had people expecting them home, had conversations left unfinished. They had lives that ended without warning, in a location they had no reason to fear, at the hands of someone they had no reason to suspect. The disappearances of women from massage and escort services presented a specific, structural investigative challenge, one that went beyond the competence of any individual detective. In South Korea in 2004, the industries in which these women worked occupied legal gray zones, not fully regulated, not fully criminalized, but socially stigmatized in ways that had direct consequences for how disappearances were handled. Families who didn't know where their daughters worked couldn't report them missing accurately. Co-workers who knew were sometimes reluctant to involve police in the affairs of an industry that operated in shadow. The agencies themselves had limited legal accountability. You had, deliberately or by intuition, chosen a victim population that the system was structurally least equipped to pursue. At the same time, the investigation into the Gangnam and Jongno murders, the wealthy household killings, was proceeding on a completely separate track. Different detectives, different case files, different units. The behavioral similarities between the two sets of murders, the organized approach, the absence of robbery, the specific target selection, were not visible to investigators who were not looking at both sets of cases simultaneously. South Korea in 2004 had no formal criminal profiling infrastructure. The analytical methodology developed in the United States over the previous 3 decades, examining crime scene behavior, victim selection patterns, geographic clustering, psychological indicators, had not been institutionalized in Korean law enforcement. There was no unit whose job was to sit across multiple open cases and ask whether a single person might be responsible for all of them. Investigator Kwon Il-yong, who would later become the country's first formally recognized criminal profiler and who conducted the most extensive documented interviews with Yoo after his arrest, was not yet positioned during the active killing period to deploy those analytical tools at the operational level. The discipline he would help build didn't exist yet in any formal capacity. The investigation was not incompetent. It was running with the tools and frameworks available in 2004. Those frameworks were not designed for what Yoo was doing. 20 people died in that gap. July 15, 2004. The owner of a massage parlor in Seoul had been paying attention for months. Several of her employees had vanished after taking client calls. No explanation, no contact afterward. Just gone. She had started keeping informal records, dates, phone numbers, patterns, and when a call came in that matched a number she had connected to previous disappearances, she did not wait for police to act on information she wasn't sure they had. She organized. She gathered several employees and contacted an off-duty police officer she knew personally. The group went together to the arranged meeting location, intending to be there when Yoo arrived. The off-duty officer left before Yoo showed up. Prior obligations. The women stayed. When Yoo Young-chul arrived, expecting to find a lone woman, he found a group of people who were ready for him. They moved on him immediately. They physically restrained him and held him until a second police officer reached the scene. The man who had killed 20 people, who had operated in Seoul for nearly a year without being identified, let alone caught, was stopped by the women he had called expecting to kill. Women who had watched their co-workers disappear. Women who had decided they were not going to be next. At the moment of restraint, Yoo simulated an epileptic seizure. It was not improvisation. He had used this exact tactic during a 2002 arrest for sexual assault. The performance had caused officers to loosen their grip, and he had used the opportunity to his advantage. In July 2004, it worked again. The grip eased. He broke free and ran. He was recaptured 12 hours later. The city had been alerted. His description was circulating. He had nowhere to go that wasn't already narrowing around him. 12 hours after escaping, he was back in custody. The interrogation process that followed Yoo's arrest was extensive, documented, and unlike most criminal confessions in South Korean legal history. He did not deny. He did not deflect. He was, in a controlled and deliberate way, forthcoming, releasing information in increments, maintaining a degree of authority over the process even from a position of custody. He understood that what he said would define how the case was understood publicly, legally, and historically. He was managing that narrative from the first day. On the first day of formal questioning, he confessed to 19 murders, not 20, 19. The details he provided matched what investigators could verify at existing crime scenes. He was not inflating the count. He was precise. On July 18th, 3 days after his arrest, he added one more. On July 19th, he stated that the actual total was 26. 6 additional victims beyond the 20 he had given details for. No names, no locations, no specifics that investigators could act on. The claim could not be verified. The confirmed count stayed at 20. Whether those 6 were real, fabricated, or a deliberate exercise in keeping investigators uncertain has never been resolved. Approximately 1 month into custody, Yoo made a statement that generated international headlines within days. He claimed that he had removed and consumed the livers of some of his victims. No physical evidence was ever found to support this. The forensic examination of remains recovered from the Banwon hillside produced no confirmation. The claim could not be proven. It also could not be disproven. What investigators who dealt directly with Yoo noted consistently across multiple documented accounts was that he understood exactly what these statements did. He had watched the media coverage. He knew his case was becoming the most discussed criminal proceeding in Korean history. He was not confessing to cannibalism out of guilt or compulsion. He was making a statement that would guarantee a particular kind of attention. He was performing. The physical details of those interrogation sessions, documented by Kwon Il-yong and other investigators who were present, are striking in their specificity. Yoo was calm, not the forced calm of someone suppressing panic, genuinely, observably relaxed. He drank tea during sessions in which he described murders in detail. He occasionally smiled, not at the content, but at observations he found intellectually interesting. He corrected investigators when he felt they had mischaracterized a detail. He engaged with psychological concepts when they were raised and often extended them to his own behavior without being asked. What he would not do, what every session confirmed he was structurally incapable of, was acknowledge the people he had killed as people. They existed in his framework as categories. Wealthy people who had accumulated comfort at the expense of people like him. Women who had betrayed men like him. Categories that, in his accounting, had warranted consequences. The individuals within those categories, their actual lives, their families, the specific weight of 20 specific deaths, were not present in his thinking in any detectable way. The psychiatric evaluation confirmed what the interrogations had shown. No psychotic disorder, no delusional thinking, no dissociative episodes, no legal basis for diminished responsibility. The diagnosis was antisocial personality disorder, a pervasive pattern of disregard for others, an absence of empathy, and the construction of a private moral framework that justified his behavior internally. But antisocial personality disorder is not psychosis. It does not impair legal awareness. Yoo knew what the law said. He had chosen to disregard it. In a televised statement, sitting before cameras with the composure of someone who had thought about this moment, Yoo looked directly into the lens and said, "Women shouldn't be prostitutes, and the rich should be punished for what they've done." That was the ideology. 2 sentences, 20 people. When the name Richard Chase came up, the American killer known as the Vampire of Sacramento, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, Yoo's response was immediate and unambiguous. Chase was sick. I am not. He said it as a distinction, as a point of pride. In the months following Yoo's arrest, criminal investigator Kwon Il-young was granted access to conduct a structured series of interviews. Kwon was operating in a space that barely existed yet in Korean law enforcement. He had studied behavioral analysis methodology developed largely in the United States, the FBI's behavioral science unit work from the 1970s and 1980s, the frameworks developed by John Douglas and Robert Ressler through their systematic interviews with incarcerated killers, the idea that a crime scene is a behavioral document that can be read. None of that methodology had been formally integrated into Korean police practice. Kwon was building the Korean version of that discipline as he worked. What he found in Yoo was a subject unlike most violent offenders in the Korean system. Yoo was highly self-aware. He engaged with psychological questions intellectually rather than defensively. He was willing to discuss his own cognition, his own emotional states, his own reasoning, up to the precise boundary of where that discussion might produce genuine self-reflection. At that boundary, he stopped, not because he couldn't go further, but because going further would have required acknowledging something he refused to accept. The conversations between Kwon and Yoo are among the most extensively documented exchanges between a Korean investigator and a convicted serial killer in the country's history. Kwon described Yoo as someone who understood manipulation as a natural mode of interaction, not as a tactic he deployed deliberately, but as a default orientation. He manipulated guards, interviewers, journalists, and courtroom observers, not because he calculated each interaction, but because that was simply how he moved through the world. Kwon's work on the Yoo case and on other major criminal cases that followed became the foundation for a formal behavioral analysis unit within the Korean National Police Agency. The methodology that had not existed in time to help the investigation during the murders was institutionalized directly because of the failures the murders had exposed. Kwon later wrote a memoir about his career as Korea's first criminal profiler. It became one of the best-selling nonfiction books in the country. In 2022, it was adapted into the television drama Through the Darkness, which depicted Kwon's work, including the Yoo case, and introduced the concepts of behavioral analysis to millions of Korean viewers who had never encountered them before. Yoo Young-chul, in a grim and indirect way, built Korean criminal profiling. The first court session was held on September 6, 2004, less than 2 months after his arrest. The speed reflected both the clarity of the evidence and the intensity of public pressure for legal resolution. Yoo arrived and announced a boycott of the proceedings. He then issued what he characterized as an apology to the victims' families. In the same address, without apparent awareness of the contradiction, he stated that he had not planned to stop killing. The apology and the declaration of continued intent arrived in the same breath. On a subsequent court date, as he was being brought before the bench, he lunged at 3 judges simultaneously. Officers intervened before contact was made. The session was suspended. The night before the October 4th hearing, guards conducting a routine check found him in the midst of a suicide attempt. He was given medical treatment. The hearing proceeded as scheduled the following morning. At a third session, a man in the public gallery shouted an insult. Yoo turned and attempted to reach him across the intervening space. 3 officers had to physically restrain him. Outside the prosecutor's office, on a court transit day, the mother of one of his victims rushed toward him in the street. She was screaming. She was carrying an umbrella. The officer walking alongside Yoo kicked her in the chest, hard enough to knock her back. His official explanation when questioned: both hands were occupied restraining the prisoner. The photograph of that moment appeared across Korean newspapers. It became one of the defining images of a case that had already consumed national attention for months, not because of what Yoo had done in that moment, but because of what the image showed. Even in transit, even in the most controlled and managed circumstances, the system could construct around him. The chaos he generated extended outward to the people who had survived the destruction of their families. The verdict was delivered on December 13, 2004. Seoul Central District Court, 20 counts of murder, death. The court's written ruling stated that the crimes were without precedent in the history of the Republic of Korea, that the scale, deliberateness, and sustained nature of the murders represented the gravest conceivable offense against human life, that no other sentence could be proportionate. South Korea executed its last prisoner on December 30, 1997. That date matters because when Yoo Young-chul was sentenced to death in December 2004, he was sentenced into a system that had not carried out an execution in 7 years, and whose trajectory, before his case disrupted it, had been moving toward formal abolition. The moratorium had been in place since 1997. Human rights organizations were active. Legal academics were engaged. Public opinion polling showed a measurable drift away from support for capital punishment as the 1990s gave way to the 2000s. The question of whether South Korea would abolish the death penalty was, before July 2004, a live and open political conversation. The Yoo Young-chul case changed the temperature of that conversation overnight. Public polling conducted in the months following his arrest showed a sharp and sustained reversal in support for the death penalty, not only for Yoo specifically, but as a general legal instrument. The abstract argument against state-sanctioned execution became very difficult to maintain publicly in a country that had just watched one man kill 20 people in 1 year, in one city, while expressing no remorse and declaring he had not intended to stop. The debate has not been resolved. As of the time of this documentary, the moratorium remains in place. No execution has been carried out in South Korea for nearly 3 decades. Yoo Young-chul, sentenced to death in December 2004, remains alive. The sentence handed down over 20 years ago has not been carried out. His continued existence is not merely a legal fact, it is a political argument. Every year that passes without an execution is, for the families of his victims, another year of a verdict that exists on paper and nowhere else. The first years of Yoo's detention at Seoul Detention Center provided consistent and documented evidence that incarceration had not altered his fundamental orientation toward authority and the people responsible for managing him. He made demands, specific food preferences, coffee delivered at late hours, particular accommodations outside the standard conditions of his confinement. He moved through the prison environment as though the rules applied to other people, as though his continued compliance with basic institutional requirements was a favor he was doing the system, revocable at his discretion. Some guards complied with small requests. The reasons would become clear later. He was also, at some point during his early years of detention, beaten. A group of other inmates, members of organized crime networks serving sentences in the same facility, attacked him. The beating was severe. It was not officially sanctioned, and the perpetrators were disciplined. But within the prison population, the event was noted. Even among people who had committed serious crimes themselves, Yoo's case had a particular weight. In 2014, 10 years after his conviction, an internal investigation at the Seoul Detention Center revealed what had been happening with those compliant guards. Yoo had been systematically bribing them. The currency was not money. It was requests, specific items not permitted under detention regulations. Japanese manga comics, erotic magazines, small material comforts that, taken individually, might seem trivial, but that collectively demonstrated something important. Yoo had spent a decade inside a maximum security facility and had still found a way to manipulate the people responsible for monitoring him. Disciplinary action was taken against the guards involved. Yoo was transferred to a maximum security facility in Daegu. Stricter conditions, fewer opportunities for the kind of informal relationship cultivation he had practiced in Seoul. In 2023, he was transferred back to Seoul Detention Center. The reasons for that decision were not made public. He is still there. The Yoo Young-chul case entered Korean culture at a depth that few criminal cases reach in any country, not as a curiosity or a tabloid spectacle, but as a structural event that reshaped how the country understood crime, investigation, and institutional failure. The first major artistic response came from filmmaker Na Hong-jin, who used the case as the direct creative foundation for his 2008 thriller, The Chaser. Na inverted the central dynamic, centering the story on a former police officer turned escort agency manager who begins to realize his employees are disappearing because of a single client, and used the procedural and institutional failures of the real investigation as the emotional engine of the film. The negligence, the missed connections, the systems that should have flagged something and didn't, all of it was present in the fiction in ways that Korean audiences recognized immediately. The Chaser premiered at the Berlin International Film Festival. It won multiple awards on the international circuit, became one of the highest-grossing Korean films of its year domestically, and has since been consistently cited as one of the finest Korean crime films ever produced. It is still watched and discussed internationally today. In 2021, Netflix produced a 3-part documentary series titled The Raincoat Killer: Chasing a Predator in Korea. The series focused on the investigation, the police work, the failures, the eventual arrest, and featured interviews with law enforcement personnel and individuals connected to the case. It brought Yoo Young-chul's name and story to a global audience that had not been following South Korean crime news in 2004. In 2022, the drama Through the Darkness aired on a Korean network based directly on Kwon Il-young's memoir about his career as a profiler. The show depicted the development of behavioral analysis in Korean law enforcement, with the Yoo case as a central thread. It received critical acclaim, significant viewership, and introduced an entirely new generation of Korean viewers to the specific sequence of events and failures that the case had exposed. The institutional changes that followed the case were less visible, but arguably more significant than any of the cultural productions it inspired. The failures identified in the investigation, disconnected case files, the absence of cross-unit behavioral analysis, the structural disadvantage of victims who worked in stigmatized industries, contributed directly to reforms in the Korean National Police Agency. A formal behavioral analysis unit was established. Protocols for information sharing between investigative units were restructured. The Yoo case became the central teaching case in the professional development of Korean criminal profiling. The system that failed to stop Yoo Young-chul before his 20th murder was fundamentally changed because of what he did. The women who disappeared, the elderly couples killed in their homes, the street vendor, they are the reason that system exists in its current form. That is not justice. It is not even close to justice. But it is what happened. There is a specific kind of fear that a case like this produces, not the fear of a stranger in a dark alley, not the diffuse anxiety of random violence, but something more disorienting. The fear that someone can move through a city of 10 million people, kill 20 of them across 11 months, operate with planning and patience and methodical deliberateness, and remain invisible until the gaps in the system that were always there protect him long enough to reach a body count that should never have been possible. Yoo Young-chul was not invisible because he was supernatural. He was not a ghost. He was not a monster in any mythological sense that would make him easier to categorize and therefore easier to dismiss. He was a man with a hammer and a list of categories of people he had decided deserved to die. He was invisible because the victims of his first phase were being investigated separately from the victims of his second phase. Because the women who disappeared worked in industries the system was slow to protect. Because the analytical tools that might have connected the behavioral patterns across both sets of cases did not yet exist in Korean law enforcement in a form that could reach him in time. 20 people died in that gap. The families of those 20 people have been waiting since December 13, 2004, for a sentence to be carried out. They have watched Yoo Young-chul spend over 2 decades alive in South Korean detention, transferred between facilities, appearing occasionally in news updates, the subject of legal and political arguments about capital punishment that have nothing to do with what he did to their families and everything to do with a moratorium that preceded his crimes by 7 years and has outlasted his sentencing by over 20. The hills around Banwon Temple are still there. Hikers walk those trails on weekends. The temple still functions. Most people who have walked that hillside since 2004 have no idea what was buried beneath their feet in the summer of that year. Yoo Young-chul is still alive. The sentence is still pending. And the question at the center of this case, how a man can kill 20 people in one city in 1 year before anyone connects the picture, has been studied, reformed around, adapted into films and dramas and documentaries, built into the training of an entire generation of Korean investigators. But it has never been fully answered, because to answer it fully would require acknowledging how many of those 20 people fell through gaps that existed long before you decided to walk through them. That is the part of this story that does not end with his arrest. That is the part that is still unresolved.